Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. What I'm going to present in this talk is quite simple. The neologism telegraph appears at the end of the 18th century during the French Revolution. It essentially means writing from afar or writing into the distance. On the other hand, the original term for the French telegraph conceived by Claude Chabre was tachygraph, signifying writing fast. So we have movement in space and the notion of distance as two fundamental aspects of this form of writing. If these new cultural techniques introduce a heightened sense of ubiquity to writing practices, it leads us to ponder their side effects. As you will see, ultimately, telegraphy is a form of writing that has departed from the page to unfold itself into the environmental medium, that is, into the landscape. So in the first part of this presentation, we will delve into this environmental medium, that is the specific setting in which this writing occurs. And in the second part, I will examine how these emerging cultural techniques of writing introduce new dimensions to text, transforming the very essence of what it means to write. But before I start, let's just agree on the technical terms. Optical or air telegraphs represent a family of technical objects that share the same signaling principle, appearing in series in the landscape, be it in urban or rural settings, and displaying signals to be observed with the help of a telescope from the first station, where the writing begins, by the intermediate stations, before arriving to the terminal station. Let me now continue with this fascinating phrase from the inventor of the French telegraph, "J'écris dans l'espace," I write in space. This in space is significant. Space emerges as a new medium where signs are drawn fleetingly, demanding a perspective different from the typical reader of a book or a manuscript. This kind of writing is linked with a specific gaze, as demonstrated by these simplified landscape versions, which for its period appear very anachronistic in terms of artistic conventions. In these landscapes, what is accentuated is the use of prominent focal points, variations in color, and stark contrast. They represent an idealized landscape for the telegraphic gaze, where nothing obstructs the view. What these inventors wanted is to assure a visual line of communication. As writing shifts into the landscape, issues of visibility take center stage. How is the visual line of communication is assured? Mostly by clearing the view. Here are just a few examples of the images. There must be air around the machines, wrote one of the inventors. This means that visibility must be enhanced. Our observations, quote, have shown that the machine will be perfectly visible in the chosen location, and by clearing very few trees, it will appear against the backdrop of the earth, which only the red color can overcome, unquote. Towards the end of the 19th century, when the optical telegraph was being used as a new form based on the principle of interrupting the light beam, the question of the screen for writing and visibility still persisted. Quote, when a station needs to be established on a treeless hill, it is advisable as much as possible to avoid positioning it at the summit of that hill. By descending a few meters down the slope, a natural screen is created, making the reading process easier. So clearing the view, especially when establishing the very first lines of communication, would involve the removal of trees that obstruct the line of sight and the destruction of tower bells, particularly if these ones are situated prominently along this communication line. But even with that carte blanche for vandalism granted during the radical years of the revolution, there would still be problems. Clearing the view would not suffice. That's why one would use the skyline, for instance. So in 1796, French painter and physicist Nicolas Jacques Conté successfully conducted the first test of another invention called aerograph, which means writing in the air. It was designed, quote, to transmit speech over long distances using aerostats, unquote, which occupy a very large space in the visible field and whose signals are emitted with help of machines on the ground. The engineer even goes so far as to propose forming, quote, an aerographic line composed of extremely high stations that are seen all the better as they always stand out in black against the sky. So when summarizing the development of the telegraphy already as early as 1794, German mathematician Johann Lorenz Böckmann arrives at the conclusion that telegraphy is simple, fast, clear, reliable, and unlimited in its action except for bad weather, because fog and rain cannot be hidden or removed from nature by human mind and the finest knowledge, and even the greatest of opticians cannot make it possible to perceive objects on the ground through miles of fog. So this point leads us into an interesting direction. Historically, we can assert that meteorology and writing were unrelated until our period. However, this changed soon after the invention of telegraph, and as the act of observing the landscape for telegraph signals became intertwined with weather observation. In 1881, Swedish inventor Abraham Edelkrans published his treatise on telegraphs, where we could read the following lines, linking two terms in the same paragraph. Each telegraph is a true observatory. Meteorology would be enriched with discoveries about the influence of heat and cold, humidity, storms, weather changes, fog, snow, rain, as well as several other meteorological phenomena on air transparency. In the visual culture of the period, telegraphic devices often exposed to open environment would often be represented in neighborhood with such technical objects as wind vanes or lightning rods, as you can see in this illustration by French illustrator Grandville. And even more here and there, instances of telegraph malfunctions are described anthropomorphically with reference to telegraph being unwell, catching a cold, once again highlighting its exposure to the ever-changing meteorological condition. And I will come to this point later. So now that we describe where this new cultural technique of writing takes place, let us explore more deeply how telegraphy altered the writing techniques. And let's start with a few examples. Though designed to communicate with ships in the early 19th century, James Ball's telegraph, an inventor from Glasgow, envisions using the front of a building, specifically its windows, as a screen. This concept of using a building as a display screen can trace, of course, its origins back to iconic signaling devices like lighthouse towers. Additionally, there's a precursor in the 17th century, as you can see here, although it was at this time was more closely tied to cryptographic thinking. Here, a way of thinking associated with printing still dominates, but we can see that the medium, instead of being the surface of a sheet of paper, is extended to the facade of a building. Furthermore, this color reversal, depending on the time of day, whether it's daytime or nighttime, paves the way to various experiments in transmitting signals and characters in the dark. We find this reinvention of the writing surface in another invention of the time called the optilog, designed at the turn of the 18th century. This device gained truly international attention, as evidenced by numerous publications in the press. In 801, its inventor published a pamphlet in Paris whose very long title, which you see here, elaborated on its various uses. The neologism optilog was proposed by the author as a generic term and indeed refers to two specific machines. The telelog, designed as a piece of furniture, allowing one house to communicate with another by following the visual line, which you see on the left. and publicateur, designed as a huge speaking tower visible from a distance, enabling, quote, the passage of a written discourse before the eyes of a gathering of people at a distance limited only by the possible dimensions of letters which the machine can make as large as desired. Thus, we observed that not only the text, as you see, set in motion, but also scaled. It is composed of colossal letters rising to a height of 1 or 2 meters and make it readable by several people at once, and thereby overturning the historical relationship between the text and the reader. To put it in an anachronistic way, text is broadcasted. Moreover, the circular notion of the cylinder introduces the concept of speed of text, transforming it from a static entity into kinetic one, as fleeting as a speech. The committee tasked with critically assessing this invention paid attention to this aspect, treating this acceleration as problematic. Quote, as letters pass successively before one's eyes, one is in a way forced to spell out the words to read and is exposed to frequent ambiguities. These two inventions addresses both visibility issues and readability of text composed of moving letters as well as thresholds of human eye perception. In that sense, the act of setting text in motion and what one could call a distancing or scaling effect become integral part to the new order of the text. The change is even more radical. What constitutes a unit of writing is also reinvented. In the optilogue, the invention that you've just seen, Belpré develops the idea of a graphic unit that forms the basis of any letter in the alphabet, which he calls the fundamental figure or the mother letter, lettre mère. 3 years later, on the other side of English Channel, for James Bow, mentioned earlier, the idea is to use a grid of squares, as you see on this slide, corresponding to the openings of a building to compose letters of the alphabet. This work, published in 1804, includes plates, as you see, representing the entire Latin alphabet as well as numbers in 2 versions for daytime and nighttime. As you can see, on a 5-to-5 grid of squares, the letter A is composed of a combination of 9 black squares, with other squares being white during the day. At night, it's the opposite. And what is interesting that you see below on the 3 of grids of squares, the same letter is A is formed by a combination of, that in this case, 6 black squares, becoming less recognizable, akin to a low-resolution pixelated image. Thus, the monolith of the character is dissolved, and the definition and resolution of text as a matrix image is born. Let me now proceed to the notion of suspension. By this term, I intend to describe the writing situation where fragments of text or messages are either lost or delayed during transmission, or the original order of the message becomes corrupted. As noted earlier, during the era of optical telegraphy, messages could be interrupted by factors such as fog or darkness, both of which we must now bring into consideration. And let's start with several examples, and taking this time from popular culture. As you see on the slides, it's the front page of two-act play, The Telegraph for General Commissioner, and right from the beginning of the first act, the telegraph is on stage. Quote, "My God, what a dreadful day. The fog has gotten worse. You can hardly see the telegraph on the Hotel de la Marine." The machine becomes a true protagonist in this comedy. One character notes, "My stomach is irritated by the fog," while another, the entire plot revolves around the suspended telegraphic news, which unexpectedly result in an employee of the Navy named Bonnard becoming the new commissioner of the Navy. However, we later learned that the fog prevented the rest of the dispatch from being distinguished. The action precisely unfolds in this, within this interruption, leading to a comedic misunderstanding. And the original title of the play, which you see in the form of draft on the right, was called Telegraph, or The Effect of the Fog. This play was preceded by a satirical text by Jean-Gilbert Imbert in the second volume of his Mœurs administratives, which provides the basis for this story. Confusion once again arises from the repeated dispatch interruptions. The first message ends with ellipsis. Mr. De, ellipsis, is appointed Mr. Off, and the whole story revolves around this ambiguity around this dispatch, which has been interrupted and creating some kind of suspense around this story. The frequent interruption of communication became evident around the 1830s. During this period, many newspapers featured a special section dedicated to publishing telegraphic dispatches in fragments with the time gaps of several hours, even days. What prevailed in this text was a specific typographical character that conveyed this silence, the ellipsis. In this context, the ellipsis indicated an absence or interruption in transmission rather than a rhetorical pause. The news could be left hanging, leaving readers in suspense. The satirical newspaper that you see on the slide, Charivari, produced most of the critical publications on this subject. The publication, titled Theory of Interrupted News and How to Use It, begins as follows. It is quite remarkable how persistently night and fog managed to cut every telegraphic news in half. And here's the story. On the March 4, 1835, the Emperor of Le Moniteur Universel reproduced the following dispatch. The Emperor of Austria was suddenly struck with a pleurisy on the day of 24. He was bleeding during the night of 24 to 25. The day of 25 was good. Towards the evening, the condition worsened. He was bleeding again, and he insisted on receiving communion. And this phrase, this dispatch, ends with ellipsis, this point de suspension, in French, and at the end of this message we have interrupted, interrompu par la nuit, interrupted by the night. The next day, however, when the other part of the message arrives, the emperor has actually already passed away, but we read in the message, following the bleeding, the symptoms of the illness ceased. The emperor had a very good day. So we actually have a situation where the emperor is dead, and this later part of the dispatch arrived after it happened. The author of the article in Charivari suspects speculative play in this telegraphic operation, as this interruption could have, quote, a significant impact on the stock market. He calls it, quote, intercepting fog, unquote, a parasite, a noise in this communication. We see that the change in the environment, the weather conditions, not only create transmission marks in the form of ellipses, but also a form of suspense. Indeed, at the same time, and you see the publication on the right, Eugène Sue publishes his Mysteries of Paris, Mystères de Paris, a serialized novel where the author often leaves the reader in suspense, establishing what would later be called, and as we know from contemporary television, a cliffhanger. A few years later, in 1842, Charivari published an article titled Mr. Sue and the Telegraph, which begins as follows. Mr. Sue is unwell, and as a result, the publication of the Mysteries of Paris is delayed by a few days. The author likens this news to interrupted telegraphic dispatches, suggesting that Eugène Sue might employ the same interrupted writing style in his novels intentionally. In fact, further in the text, we find an explicit comparison with the telegraph. And 20 years earlier, in 1823, Writing and Weather Report was already closely linked with this idea of suspension, as it appears to be at the beginning of this newspaper article. The fogs having dissipated yesterday, the return of the sun rays has brought us security and confidence along with telegraphic transmissions. Finally, we can announce the long-awaited resolution of the great drama of Cadix. This is how readers learned about the end of the expedition of Spain. After suspension, communication was resumed. And to sum up, here are 5 work-in-progress terms that characterize key resumes what basically I've just said. Spatialization, screenization, scaling, resolution, decomposition, setting in motion, suspension, interruptions, which I don't have time to comment, but you see it on the slide. And quick conclusion. For Jennifer L. Roberts, even in her book Transporting Visions, even before electrical image transmissions, images are deeply connected to geography. They are bound to specific spaces. However, this process is still transportation and not yet transmission. Same goes for text before the invention of air telegraphs. So once again, telegraphy is a form of writing that has departed from the page to unfold itself into this environmental medium into the landscape. Before images of new kind, which goes with electrical images transmission appears, there are texts of writings of new kind, and I try to show this kind of texts. Up until the invention of the electrical telegraph, text transmission devices of this kind were mainly used by the government or the military. It wasn't until the 20th century, when these transmission techniques became widespread, that the artists gained access to these tools. They began experimenting with these new forms of visual communication, be it through collective writing or the exchange of textual content with its associated delays and interruptions, or in the real-time exchange of images, focusing on the materiality of transmission itself. And I believe this serves as an introduction to our upcoming discussions today and tomorrow. Thank you.